Good? Okay. All right, so by now, I guess real quick, at this point in stage, you've now gone through the training, so you figured out how to create a good business pitch as well as what is it take to create a good business. We then get into this stage, which is on the term sheet side of things, and I'll go into explanation as to what that is. Part of that, Leslie already had covered the due diligence. So from a Red Dot's perspective, what is it considered, what is the investment criteria for Red Dot Ventures? The Angels did that as well. If you remember, Virginia Cha spoke about her due diligence side as well. So last is then the legal shareholder agreements. We don't have enough time to go through that, but the term sheet is a summary of the legal documents. So today we're going to cover specific terms in a term sheet because there's a lot of mystery and cloud around what exactly do all these terms mean and what are some tricks of the trade. How can I prevent people from taking advantage of me with this term sheet? Okay? Okay. So first off, a term sheet in brief. A term sheet is a non-legal binding, so it's a non-legal binding agreement. Essentially, once the company has seen you, they've done their due diligence, they're comfortable that they want to invest in you, they're going to issue a term sheet. And what that term sheet says is, here's a summary of the terms here are the summary of the terms that I want to agree to. It's almost like an offer, right? Here are the terms I want to agree to, the price tag, what the company's going to look like, and it's a general summary of the most important terms inside the legal agreement which follows closely thereafter. So from a term sheet side, the only two things that are somewhat binding is the confidentiality of the term sheet, of the terms, and the exclusivity. If I hand you a term sheet and you choose to sign that term sheet, you are no longer allowed for a period of time to go find someone else to, or go raise additional money somewhere else. So within that period of time, you're essentially limited to the negotiation with the person who's given you the term sheet to make sure you close the deal. That's the entire objective. So before you sign anything, make sure 100% that you are comfortable working with this other person and that essentially this is a person you want to ultimately marry, as it were. Okay? One of the great things about term sheets, though, is it's non-legally binding. So let's say throughout the term sheet, the deals go sour, or you find something else about the VC, or the VC finds something else about you. You can always break off the term sheet. Okay? So that's important. You don't need a lawyer to review the term sheet. The best way to review terms on a term sheet, first one and the cheapest, is go for friends. Friends who've been in the entrepreneur space before, who understand it, maybe understand some of the terms. Go seek their advice first. Second, go to Google. Google's got some great resources out there that you can use. These sorts of programs are posted on YouTube now. I'm sure other incubators and other training programs have the same thing. So you can go find a lot of resources with friends in Google before you even have to go to someone that you would have to pay for, like a lawyer. Okay? Okay. Right, so term sheet in brief. So it's non-legally binding. It discusses the financial instruments, the valuation, basically how is the investment structured, what is the company going to look like going forward for the next 2 years, what are some of the rights of the incubator, as well as what are some of the rights that are held by the entrepreneur, and lastly is who has ultimate control. And it's not ultimate control, but at the end of the day, what does the VC control versus what does the entrepreneur control? Okay? All right, let's get into it. So in the VC space, especially with a seed stage investment, I can only speak from my experience having worked in Red Dot Ventures, so I can speak specifically to seed stage investment, but I'll try and cover everything as a whole. There are 4 common investment vehicles. So several of them are the common shares, credit notes, convertible bonds, and redeemable convertible preference shares. What do they all mean? Because there's a lot there. So a common share is your most basic share. It's an ordinary share. It's what the founders, the co-investors, maybe a lot of the IGM will start off with. The guys that are taking a shot, the angels, right? So common share, the most basic form of a share. And so in terms of a preference level, they're the lowest in terms of preference. What does that mean? It means if someone comes in on top, either a preference share or a convertible bond, which is more of a debt-styled investment, in the event of a liquidation, they get paid first. So if you were to go out of business, and this is why a lot of investors prefer convertible bonds and credit notes, to protect their investment in the worst case scenario. So in a worst case scenario, ordinary shares or common shares are the lowest rank. They get paid last. Okay? Key terms in a common share is the voting rights. That's about it. So if there are any key decisions that need to be made that requires the company to decide, a common share gets the right to vote. And then lastly is valuation characteristics. So if an angel investor comes in, they're going to use common shares. And one of the things that they're going to want to agree on is the mutually agreed per share price. So it's the valuation. What is this share price going to be? That's really where most of the negotiation is around, is what is the price tag on that equity. Once you get into something more like credit notes or convertible bonds, now you're starting to get into more debt-structured investment schemes. This is really where the seed stage and beyond really like to play. And the reason why they play in this space is primarily because the investments that we're putting in is a significantly larger amount than what an angel would put in. So at this stage, you're really talking about we're going to invest in a debt-structured scheme. So in the worst case scenario, we get paid first. But this debt structure scheme is not necessarily we're never going to come back and ask for money back. Sometimes it's going to convert to shares. Okay? And it depends on the specific terms in each. So where do they sit in terms of preference? They sit above equity. Okay? Common shares, preference shares, those sit below anything that's debt related. In the credit notes, they get more voting rights, and it is convertible to common stock. And generally, the valuation characteristics, the negotiation on a valuation side of things, they'll say, look, I'm going to give you $50,000 or $100,000 in a credit note, and the amount of shares that I want to take is 10% discount from the next round of investment that you receive. So it will require you to raise money from the person issuing the credit notes, and then raise another round beyond that for him to determine what is the price tag on the business. And a key reason for that is to incentivize the entrepreneur. Maximize that valuation as much as possible, because that means this guy and this guy take as little as possible. Okay? Credit notes. A really good thing about credit notes recently that's popped up in Silicon Valley, not yet here in Singapore, although there's something very similar to it, is something called a SAFE. A SAFE is an IOU. It's essentially saying we're going to pay you cash in the form of a debt, and we don't want to redeem that debt. See, in anything that's considered debt, the VC, depending on what the terms are associated with that debt, the VC at any time can say, hey, I want my money back plus the interest that I am charging for that debt. Because like debt, it accrues interest. So in Silicon Valley nowadays, and the NRF-TIS scheme is very much structured this way, it's almost essentially a SAFE. It is debt, it accrues interest, but there is no redemption. And what I mean by redemption is there is no chance that the VC is going to then take the money back. Convertible bonds, the only difference between a convertible bond and a credit note is that they have specific reserve matters. I'll go into more detail on that. They have rights to board seats, and they also, their debt is redeemable. Okay? This is where they're able to ask for the money back. Conversion price is very similar to, is very similar to a price per share. It's just a fancy way of saying, if this $500,000 investment in debt converts to shares, what is it going to mean in terms of price per share? How many shares does that mean with the 500,000? And then lastly is redeemable convertible preference shares, which essentially means that these bonds turn into these shares is one option. The other option is, and Spring Seeds does this, talking about Spring Seeds. Spring Seeds likes to invest in this sort of investment structure, where essentially it's treated as equity, it's ranked above common, though below debt. It has voting rights, board seats, reserve matters, it's redeemable. So it has the same characteristics as a convertible bond. And again, it's the negotiation on the conversion price. So the only difference between these two is where it sits in terms of level of preference. Okay? All right. Okay, now let's dive into the term sheet. If you look at the first page, I'm going to work with you on this. Okay. If you look at the first page, which is furthest to the left, you're going to, this is, if you notice in red, there's a lot of XX, underlines, that sort of thing. The key secret to a VC, they use templates. And they use them over and over again. Every VC has a specific preference, and so they're going to use templates. So things that change are not necessarily the rights parts, especially because we invest with the government. The government is very specific about what they like to see. So from a lot of the term size, they don't change. The things in red are the things that do change. So the price tag of your business, the name of the company. That's about it. Okay, price tag on business, name of company, and then the capitalization table. Okay? All right. On your term sheet, you're going to find something that's called pre-money valuation. The pre-money valuation is essentially the price tag of your business. So if you go to a store today and you want to buy a basketball, and the basketball's worth $20, that's essentially what you would consider the pre-money valuation of a company. The company approaches you, and I think I'm worth $1 million. That's my pre-money valuation. Once you combine the pre-money valuation by the investment amount, the amount that the VC puts in, you get a post-money valuation. All the post-money valuation is the pre-money valuation plus the investment amount. Okay? Ask questions, by the way. I don't want this to be just a lecture in one way conversation. So bring out questions if you have them. Okay? So pre-money valuation is the investment. So post-money valuation is the pre-money valuation plus the investment amount. Now, oftentimes I get a lot of entrepreneurs asking me, well, what does that mean? I mean, who cares? What does that actually mean in terms of percentage? So what the VC will get is the investment amount divided by the post-money valuation. And that is the ownership or the percentage that the VC will get for their investment. Okay? Everyone same page? Okay. Capital structure and option pool. So a capitalization table all right. A capitalization table has some key points to it. First is the shareholder, the name of the shareholders, the number of shares that is associated with each shareholder, the amount of money that's invested by the shareholder, and lastly is the percent equity, or the relative ownership that the person has inside the business. So the important point to note here is how a capitalization table works. And honestly, this just requires a lot of math. And I'm happy to go through it with you on the board. Basically, I'll give you this example here. So founder 1 and founder 2 each own 8,000, 2,000, and 2,000 shares. So total they own 10,000 shares. This is in a pre-money state. They value their business at $1,200 today. They own 100% of their company. This is where most of you are today. If you haven't had investment, this is where you would sit. Post-money is after the investors put money in. If you recall, post-money is equal to the pre-money plus the investment amount. Okay? So it's a pre-money valuation plus the investment amount gets you the post-money valuation of the business. Okay? So just because the VC put money in Yesterday, the company was valued at 1.2 million. Today, the company is now valued at 1.6 million. If you notice, the number of shares doesn't change between founder 1 and founder 2. Those shares will stay the same. What changes is in this particular investment scheme, the VC said, you know what? We want 10% ESOP. That's an option pool. I'll explain what an ESOP is. And then second, if you recall from the last slide, if you recall from the last slide, the VC put in 400,000 for post-money valuation of 1.6, which gives him 25%. That's his 25%. 400,000. What does that translate into shares? Equals 3,846 shares. Okay? All right. What is ESOP? ESOP is option pool. Option pool is shares set aside to incentivize your key employees. Oftentimes, a lot of VCs, and at every stage, are unable to afford the salaries of some key players. They'll bring in people from M&C, they'll bring in people that are comfortable with, that are critical to the next stage of the business, but they're unable to pay them completely in cash. So ESOP is a great way to value the business. It's a great way to incentivize those people when you don't have cash to give today. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, what people have realized in California, and I think they realize here as well, is that shares are so much more valuable to an individual than just cash. In a lot of investments, especially in the NRF TIS scheme, our preference is 10%. So if you look on the second piece of paper, you'll notice on the second page, so the second you flip this page over, so essentially the third page, yeah, flip it over. At the top you'll see option pool, okay? Generally on a seed stage NRF TIS investment, we prefer 10%. And by the way, Series A, same thing. They prefer at least 10%. If you want to go over that, that's your prerogative, that's okay. More is better for a VC's perspective. From an entrepreneur's perspective, generally you want to hold on to the shares until you have to give out more. So that's why this becomes a critical negotiation step for VCs and founders, is primarily because a lot of founders want to keep the shares close, whereas a lot of VCs want shares set aside for employees. Okay? Is everyone comfortable with the capitalization table?
Would you like to elaborate on how the dilution took place?
Sure. Okay, so if you notice here, a founder one has 80%, where here, the founder one has only 52%. It's not necessarily a bad thing. So what has happened here? Basically, his founder one and founder two shares have stayed the same. In the post-money stage, ESOP and the investors' shares were put into the business. Okay, so that's probably a total of 5,300 and change, 5,400. Extra shares were put into the business. Though his shares and his shares stayed the same. So relatively, their percentage has decreased. But dilution is not necessarily a bad thing. And this is what's really important for any entrepreneur to understand. You may be diluted in your own business, but relatively speaking, the value that you own today is worth significantly more than the value it was worth yesterday. Okay? So what's really important to understand is not only pay attention to, oh, I lost 52% because this investment, what a big, what a pain. In fact, you need to look at the price per share. Because the price per share, because his shares didn't change, but the price per share increased, he may have, he owns a significantly larger amount of cash today. Okay?
How do you calculate 3846 shares?
Yeah. Okay. I can do that. 8,000, 2,000, 8,000, 2,000. All right, I think that this is a good exercise because many people actually don't understand cap tables when they approach it. So it is a good step to learn. All right, today they own 100% for 10,000 shares, right? Yep, everyone's with me so far? Okay. Now, the Series A VC or the seed stage VC invests 400,000 into the business. 1, 2, 3. Okay? If you remember this last slide, 400,000 divided by 1.6 gets him okay? That gets you 25% for the Series A. Everyone with me so far? Okay. Next step. The Series A investor wants 10% equity also in the business. Whoop, shoot. Yeah. Okay. So we have two unknowns here, and we have two unknowns here. So, easiest way to do this is you take the total sum, which is this guy here. I'll make a star, and I'll just write the equation down here. So, this is equal to the sum 8,000, 2,000 divided by 1 minus the sum of 10% and 25%. Excel. Okay? So what I've done here is 8,000 plus 2,000, 10,000, divided by 1 minus this percentage here. What that's going to give me is this number. Once I have this number, so what is this number? 15,384. Okay? Once I have this number, 15,384, 25% of 15,384 gets you this number. 10% of 15,384 gets you this number. 8,000 divided by 15,384 gets you this number. And 2,000 divided by 15,384 gets you this number.
Can I propose another way to get the outright dates?
Sure.
Since somebody else is going to come in to take away 35% of my stuff, right? I'm just going to take 80%, multiply by what I have left, which is 65%. I get it. Can you do that?
Yep, I think so. Yep.
I have another question.
Sure.
So this thing said that dilution is not exactly a bad thing, right? But in this case, if you calculate the percentage, 52% of 1.6 million, right?
Yep.
It actually gets a lower value in terms of shares because it's giving away 10% right, to the ESOPs.
Right.
So that's like, is that bad dilution?
Well, no, in this particular case, what I've done here is this is the pre-money just before the investment and post-money.
Okay.
So what you would more consider, and what oftentimes happens is people, they own 100% here, and the value of the business is, let's say, 500,000 after having raised iGEM, right? So entrepreneurs all own 100% at 500,000. By the time you get to the next round of investment, right, you're at this 1.2 or this 1.6. So let's say I own 80% of a 1.2. I'm sorry, no, that's not right. So you get 100,000. Let's say you get diluted, okay, and your post money is at 1.2. So rather than own 100% of 500,000, I own 80% of 1.2.
So basically, I'm comparing the post money from the previous round and post money.
Exactly.
Okay. And one more question.
Yep.
For ESOPs, right? So what we're doing now is that we're allocating 1,538 shares
Yeah.
to these people. But I think for Singapore law, you cannot assign the shares where nobody is holding on to it. So how do you work around that?
So,
You hold on to the shares first as a founder.
yeah, basically. So, yeah, it's basically, it's, so what happens here is this goes into a legal agreement.
Okay, so
This is,
this is only on paper, but in actual fact, you still fall.
yeah. So the ACRA, exactly, and that's a good point to make. With ESOP, this goes into a legal agreement, which basically means that there is 10% allocated for, on paper, there's 10% allocated for your employees. But it doesn't necessarily happen right away. It's only when you necessarily need them that you dip into it. Okay? Okay. Conversions and redemptions. All right, on the maturity date. So again, this is specific to Red Dot Ventures, but this should help in terms of most investment vehicles. On the maturity date, there's, all right, so if we invest in something called a convertible bond, it's debt related and it has a maturity date to it. So Red Dot Ventures invests in a convertible bond and it has a maturity date, which is a 3-year maturity date. There's automatic conversion, where a security transforms from one type of security to another type of security. So this would be the old security type, this is the new security type. So a convertible bond will, on a maturity date, convert to preference shares. Preference shares convert to common shares. Okay? So a lot of these investment vehicles have these, what I would call deadlines. And within a certain time up in that deadline, once that deadline's up, that security will change into a different security. And that means significantly different things for both the VC and the entrepreneur. So it's important to understand what is the maturity date, and this would be called a conversion, okay? So it's just more about the terminology. Conversion is I change from one security type to another. If you want to talk about a redemption, with a lot of the debt style investments, redemption is when the VC, the bond's principal, or the owner of the bond, has accumulated interest on that bond, so let's say 3 years, and then he says, you know what, I want all my money back. I don't want it to convert to shares, I want the money back instead, plus interest. So as an entrepreneur, you're taking on additional risk. It's just like you're going to a bank. Except a bank doesn't convert to shares. A bank will only take the money back. In this particular case, it can convert to shares, but it may not. Yep.
So it seems like for me as an entrepreneur, right, I'm facing double downside if the investor offers me a bond. Because if things go wrong before the thing converts, he gets a burst of those claims. If things go well after the conversion, he gets upside as well. So as an entrepreneur, when is it good for you to accept a convertible bond as a form of investment?
When you absolutely have to. It's true. It's true. So as an entrepreneur, I mean, use this as an example here. Use the valuation as an example. Let's go back to that. You want to maximize this number as much as possible. Because by maximizing this number as much as possible, the pre-money valuation as much as possible, that means this guy is taking less equity.
No, but I disagree. Because if you try to have the valuation of pre-money too high, then later on, they will have such a hard time raising more money to kind of, beat.
So yeah, I agree with that. So if you recall Leslie's talk, Leslie had the bar graphs. Do you remember those? And there was a general range of valuation for the seed stage. You want to play within that range. I mean, at the end of the day, you don't want to put this so high that you're outside of what a VC is willing to invest. Because at the end of the day, you want to close the deal, right? But in any negotiation, if you're the seller, you want to get the highest price possible that the buyer is still willing to take, so that the VC is still willing to take, and vice versa. The VC is negotiating sometimes VC is negotiating for a lowest price possible that the entrepreneur is willing to give away. Okay? So what's really important for an entrepreneur to know, and what's great about Singapore, what is so good about Singapore, is the number of grants you have. You can raise cash without having to give away a bunch of equity when you're first starting out. That is such a powerful tool, because most people in the States and everywhere else, they instantly give away equity, or they mortgage their home and they sell their car. So what you guys have is a unique opportunity today that probably doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Okay? So as an entrepreneur, what is a good question to ask is, when's a good time to raise money? And who are the best investors, right?
And how much to raise? You don't want to raise too much as well.
Exactly. So here's a few key points. In terms of when to raise money, you want to raise money, ballpark. You want to start raising money 6 months prior to you running out of cash. That's a general rule for Singapore, because it takes on average 6 months for any VC to make any decision and have the money come into your business. The second thing, what was it? When? How much? So how much? Very simple. You need to think 2 steps ahead. So if I'm in seed stage here, I'm sorry, pre-seed. Hi, Jam. Then there's a seed stage, and then Series A. Okay, if I'm a pre-seed investor, I'm not pre-seed investor, pre-seed entrepreneur, and I need to raise cash, how much cash do I need to raise? Well, if I'm pre-seed and I'm raising for seed stage, right, because I've already done the pre-seed, I'm probably somewhere right here in terms of timeline. Does that make sense? You're really close to that seed stage. Essentially, you're considered seed stage. Okay? So how much cash do I need? Enough cash to take me to Series A. So you need to think 2 steps ahead. Yeah, enough cash to take you to Series A. So for example, what is a Series A investor looking for and regarding my business? And so how much cash do I need to make sure I hit that milestone? Yeah.
So can I do a simple calculation? I've got my inflows, projected inflows, and my outflows.
Yep.
I sum up all the negative net cash flows, and I add 3 months for my existing budgeting Z. Is that how you calculate this one?
So basically, what I'll say is, on average, I'll give you the secrets here. So on average, it takes about 18 months from a seed stage investment to a Series A, on average. Okay? Seed stage investors like to see 24. They get a bit hesitant on the 12 months. Okay? Because on average, it takes 18 months. Why? Because the minute the seed stage investor puts money into your business, they're already selling you to the Series A. So we come in, we get a quick picture as to who you are, we give you some advice, maybe you need to change this pivot, maybe you got to correct that, and then we're instantly to the Series A and we're selling you. We're going to the Series A guy and we're saying, hey, we got this great guy we just invested in, you should check him out, meet the founders, 18 months time, he'll be ready on your doorstep. Okay, actually 12 months time. 12 months time, right? Because you need 6 months to raise money. Okay? So how much do I need? You need to look at your cash flow. You need to make a conservative assessment. And you need to decide what is required. If I'm here, what is required to achieve my Series A? So you need to think 2 steps ahead. Okay? But for all of you, there's a really easy way to do it. There's a super easy trick. Singapore has 15 TIS NRF seed stage investors. And each and every one of them invests $589,000 set rate, because that is the maximum leverage that they're going to get from NRF. So you don't actually, in Singapore, you don't need to know how much you need to raise. You just need to raise $589 from a TIS investor. Okay? So you guys are very lucky, no math involved. What? Okay. Next on the term sheet is liquidation preference. So one thing that's important about what is liquidation preference versus what is a participant. Ready? Okay. A liquidation preference essentially protects the investor's initial investment in a worst case scenario. Okay? So what does that mean? In a worst case scenario, if a business, the business we've been talking about, worth 1.6, right? Worth 1.6 million, all of a sudden goes out of business. That VC wants to capture his initial investment. So from a seed stage perspective, if we put in $589,000 and the company goes out of business, we want to capture as much back as possible. We want to, when we pull the trigger, essentially when we say, you know what, founders, do you agree business isn't going to work? Yes. VC, do you agree? Yes. Okay, let's take what's left back out. In most investment cases, if a company goes out of business, it means they're out of cash. So liquidation preference is not necessarily something that kicks in all the time. Okay? But occasionally, if the entrepreneur and the VC both agree that it's time to close up shop, and I'll give you an example. There's a business in our portfolio whose technology was essentially considered useless because Samsung came out with this new device that put them out, essentially rendered the technology that our portfolio company had as useless. So in that case, we went to the entrepreneur, we said, hey entrepreneur, I think it's time to shut it down. What do you think? Entrepreneur says, yep, great, liquidation preference for us. So we capture what's left, okay? In some cases, a liquidation preference also is part of an IPO or an acquisition. And in these cases, a liquidation preference behaves slightly differently. Because in an IPO or an acquisition, generally the startup is getting a lot more money than when it went out of business, right? When it went out of business, generally you'd be lucky if you capture half of what you invested. But during an IPO or an acquisition, there's a lot more cash running around. So what does a liquidation preference mean in one of those two events? First off, something called participating preference. Well, let's go liquidation first. All right, in a liquidation, in an IPO or the company gets acquired, the investor secures $400,000 of their initial investment. And in a participating preference, they then get to share what assets are remaining. I don't know if that was clear. This is the startup. This is what it has in terms of cash. The company gets acquired for this amount. So this is all the cash in the company today. Now, if I have liquidation preference and participating preference, I first take out my $400,000, which was my initial investment, before anyone else can touch this amount of cash. So I take out my first $400,000, and on top of that, by the way, I own 25% in the business. So once I take out the $400,000, I can then take out 25% of the remaining $1 million. Okay? This is what is called liquidation preference, and this is participating preference. Now, not everyone behaves this way. Not all investment vehicles are like this. Sometimes they'll say, rather than us share in the winnings, what we will do instead is, rather than a 1x liquidation preference, which is 1 times our investment amount, we will take instead a 2x or 1.5x our original investment amount. So if we put in $400,000 and I have a 2x liquidation preference, rather than take $400,000, I'm going to take $800,000. Okay?
What's the market rate?
Market rate?
What was the acceptable norm term? Do they start at 2x?
Sure. Hey guys, Okay, market rate for liquidation preference, very simple. In Singapore with NRF TIS,
Sorry, I can't hear him. Thank you.
liquidation preference in Singapore is very simple. With NRF TIS, liquidation preference is generally 1.5 or 1, 1.5x or 1, and then they have this participating element to it. Okay? That's in Singapore, that's NRF TIS. Now, if you were to go to the States, slightly different. Because the number of VCs in the States, VCs had to become more competitive. So there's more favorable terms to the entrepreneur. Generally what they will take is a 1.5 or 2x of the initial amount. See, in this particular example, this participating preference looks really good compared to a 2x. But rather than think of this business closing out at a 1.6 million, think of Facebook out here. 25% of this is a lot more than $400,000. Okay? So what the liquidation preference does, as long as it's not participating preference, it encourages the VC to switch to common shares. So liquidation preferences without participating preference forces the VC to switch to common shares and share equally, without this step, share equally with every other shareholder in the total winnings. Okay? Does that make sense? Confused face. Everyone okay? All right. So in Singapore today, it's 1.5 or 1x, and it's also participating for seed stage investment. Okay? So it's going to look a lot like this. Okay. Anti-dilution. I'm an investor, and I invest in a business $100,000. And there's a good math example inside the explanation sheet. So not the term sheet, but the explanation sheet. So you can go back through it in your own time. There are two types of anti-dilution, but essentially anti-dilution protects the investor's relative ownership in the startup. So let's say I take 25% today. And now all of a sudden, the business raises another round of funding, but significantly lower valuation than I came in. So here I am taking more risk because I invested in the business before anybody else. And the business is not doing well. Partially my fault, sure. Partially the entrepreneur's fault. And now they're raising a round that's worth less than my stake. Because they're raising a round that's worth less than my stake, this 25% I worked so hard to negotiate for is going to get diluted. And not just a little bit, but a lot. So anti-dilution protects the investor's relative ownership in the startup. It protects this 25%. Okay? Basically, to explain it a different way, if a startup raises $100,000, $10,000, dollar per share. Okay? So he has 10,000 shares in the business, dollar per share, 10,000. So he's a $10,000 value business, right? If all of a sudden, so that's $1 per share. If all of a sudden that $1 per share price goes to 50 cents per share, the company's worth half, my 25% is now worth half. So I want to make sure that this doesn't change. Not the percentage, the actual value, the amount of money I put in doesn't change. So if the company's worth half, the amount that I put in is still worth the $100,000 I put in initially. Okay? There are two types of anti-dilution. There's weighted average and there's full ratchet. What I'm going to, because there's a lot of math involved, the one thing that's really important to know, never do this. Okay? VCs that are piggish are going to go after you for this. It's unlikely you see them today, but it still happens. This is where they'll take full advantage of you. Okay? What is the difference? So full ratchet means that, let's say, I invest in this business and it's $2 per share, so it's $20,000 value here. And I put in $100,000 and I get, well, that's not true. Sorry. $3 per share. I put in $100,000, I get 25%. Okay? There you go. $3 per share. I put in $100,000, I get 25% of the business. All right? Now, in a full ratchet case, if, let's say, the next stage of investment, the entrepreneur says, I'm going to raise one share for $1. Because he raised one share for $1, and my shares were worth $3 per share, my shares are now worth, in a full ratchet case, $1 per share. So I put in 100,000. I put in 100,000, right, into the business to get myself 25%. $100,000. So $100,000 at $3 per share gets me what is it? 33 shares, right? Now let's say instead I put in that same $100,000, and because of full ratchet, because he raised one share for $1, now my $100,000, my share price is now changed to $1 per share. Now I get 100,000 shares. What does that mean? Well, see, for founder A and founder B, their share numbers don't change. So I crush them. I push them out of their own business. And by the way, banks, so I can tell there's one major bank in Australia that has a VC arm. They do this occasionally to take out the founders if they feel the founders are not doing as well as they would have expected. So they will push you out of your own business. So you don't go for full ratchet. What weighted average does is slightly different. It's a lot more fair. It's a lot more accepted in the market. A weighted average will say, yes, this person raised $1 per share, but he only raised one share. In the last round, we raised, ballpark, 100,000 shares. So his $1 per share isn't going to impact the business in any significant way. So weighted average will factor in all the historical share raises along the way. Does that make sense? They consider what is one share to versus what has already been raised in the total outstanding. Okay, here's an example. Okay? Not that difficult. All right. So this equation, if you guys look in the term sheet, this equation is there. And if you look in the explanations, the equation and the example are there. So you're able to work on this example at home. But if you look, basically, the general gist is what happens in anti-dilution. First, I own 3,846 shares at the amount of money that I put in. So I put in, what is it, $400,000. Okay? So, given the same $400,000, the investor gets more shares because of anti-dilution. He had 3,846. Here's a bridge round. He now has 3,883. Not a significant jump. The dollar per share price went from 104, which is what I went in on, versus the other guy raised at $100 per share. But I'm not going to take mine at $100 per share. I'm going to take mine at $103 per share because of this equation. Okay? If I were to take my shares at $100 per share on a $400,000 investment, this wouldn't be 3,883. This would be 4,000. So I would have that much bigger of a jump. Okay? So, moral of the story, this is standard in the practice. This is what you want to go for. Look for this equation and just verify that this equation is the same equation that matches up in your term sheet. Okay? You do that, you should be fine. And by the way, NRFCIS, this is standard across the board. So, if you're raising seed stage in Singapore, you don't have to worry about it. Okay. Rights for stock sale and purchase. How are we doing on time, by the way?
8:34.
8:30? Okay, so I got to wrap it up. Good. Okay, rights for stock sale and purchase. So investors, once they put money in, they're going to have additional rights. So what we've covered are several rights that protect their relative investment and relative ownership in the business. There are additional rights that protect their interests in the business as well. So one of them is called the tag-along right. Tag-along essentially means that the investor is able to sell alongside the last round's shareholders. Okay, so basically what happens in tag-along essentially, and you don't see a lot of this in the NRF-TIS stuff, but if an investor puts money in and one of these entrepreneurs says, hey look, I want to sell my shares, this investor gets the right to sell along with the other shareholders in the business. So that's called tag-along rights. Okay? That one's not so much current today because we have other things like the right of first refusal and drag-along. So right of first refusal gives the VC the ability to purchase a share for sale, a share that's for sale by current shareholders before third parties. So I'll give you an example. Founder A has 8,000 shares. Founder A wants to sell 600,000 of those shares to their buddy. Because I've invested and because I have right of first refusal, he has to sell me those shares first and I have to say no before he can sell to anybody outside of the company. Or essentially outside of the investment firm. Because I'm the guy with the rights. Okay? The reason why this is designed is because a lot of VCs want to ensure that there is essentially there is control over who sits inside the shareholding structure. A company can have these rights as well. And it's important because, and I gave you some good tips inside the second sheet. The second sheet, as a company, you can have all these rights I've mentioned. Companies will sometimes say, look, I want right of first refusal before the investor. The reason why is because I want to control who can own shares in my company. A VC generally will say, well, sorry, it's not going to happen. We want to control who's going to invest in your company. Okay? For two reasons. First, if a company has founder 1 through founder 8, or investor 1, angel 1 to invest angel 8, it gets very complicated for the next round of investors. And no one's going to want to invest in a business that has all these different shareholders they got to look after. And so what they want is very simple, clean capitalization structures. Because the more complicated it gets, the more stakeholders the next investor has to manage, and the less attractive the deal looks. And since my job as a seed stage investor is to get to Series A, all I care about is having a clean capitalization table. I don't want your brother, your mother, your aunt all involved in the business because that cap table is going to look very complicated and unattractive for the Series A investor. Okay, so it's really important to keep it simple.
Question. So the right of first refusal, it's quite common, but have you come across the term sheet or part of the contract where there is sort of a cap or a maximum price of the shares?
Maximum price of the shares, as in when it gets sold?
Yeah.
Not in my experience. So I haven't seen that yet. I'm sure,
Similar to the warrants and the options, that way, like there's a price tag to it.
Yeah, I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that. Yeah, you mean with right of first refusal? If you're going to sell it, then I have a right to purchase it, and this is the maximum.
Yes, correct.
At the lesser of the two.
Correct.
I haven't seen that. I'm sure it exists. The Series A investors that we've dealt with, as well as ourselves in NRF-TIS, they don't have that. Okay. But yeah, and this is the other thing too. I mean, what I'm giving you is the very bare bones. That's why I suggest you use, as resources, you use your friends who've gone through the process, you use Google, go do your own research, call up VCs, talk to them about it, because oftentimes there are tricks, there are loopholes, there are systems, there's all sorts of stuff. And I can teach you a lot of the ways to avoid some of that, okay? But I can't tell you all because there's so many different things and I just don't know them all. Okay? Okay, drag along. Drag along is the last right. The last right drag along means that Series A, you're not going to see this for seed stage, this drag along sort of stuff. But you will see drag along for things that are much later in stage. Drag along rights gives the last investor or the holder of that right the right to pull everyone else into the deal if over 51% of the total outstanding shares agrees to the deal. So let's say you have founder 1, founder 2, Series A, and maybe you have a third founder in there who owns 5%, right? And generally, you need all the stockholders or all the shareholders to agree before you can go ahead with the next deal. What you don't want is that guy that only has 5 shares to hold up everything for everybody else. And so drag along rights suggests that if majority of the shareholders agree, then those who disagree, regardless of what they think, they're coming along. Okay? And that's important because drag along rights, without drag along rights, oftentimes the deal probably couldn't get through. And so drag along rights will enable you the opportunity to actually move ahead with the business without having to make sure everyone's happy all the time, especially a minority shareholder that happens to be a problem. Most minority shareholders are just fine. They work with you. They're happy just like you are. But if you get that one problem, drag along rights becomes very helpful, and as an entrepreneur and as an investor. Okay? All right. Okay. So last one is board seat and reserve matters. This is very standard across most seed stage investment terms or investment agreements. Usually it's standard for a seed stage or Series A and later investment stages to require 1 or 2 board seats. So what does that mean? We have the right but not the obligation to take a board seat. For a lot of companies, they like to have, for a lot of investors, they like to sit on the board. They like to make sure that they have a lot of control in the businesses. Some investors prefer not to sit on the board, and for several reasons. One is, so in NRF CIS, for example, so in NRF CIS, because it's a standard investment agreement, I can share this with you. NRF CIS says that you can have 4 board members. NRF is allowed to appoint 1, the investor is allowed to appoint 1, and then the entrepreneurs can appoint 2. Now, essentially, in all over 100 deals that NRF has done, I don't think, in my opinion, I don't think they sit on the board of many. So that leaves 2 entrepreneurs and 1 investor to sit on the board. Now let's say we go in, and these 2 entrepreneurs want to do one thing, and the investor wants to do something else. Who's going to win in this debate? The founders, right? Let's say NRF does take a board seat, and it's 2 founders, and they have one opinion, and the investor and NRF have a separate opinion. Who's going to win in that deal? Stalemate. Okay? So sometimes taking the board or having this board term is not necessarily an advantage or a disadvantage for the VC. Okay? So what you need to be very careful of is the total number of board seats that exist. What a VC will do instead, if they know that sitting on the board is not going to achieve what's important, because VC likes to sit on the board to make sure that you don't have runaway founders or rogue founders or any these issues where it becomes out of the control of the VC. This is why they prefer to have these rights. So on a reserve matter, if they know that sitting on the board is not going to protect their interests, they then create things called reserve matters. And reserve matters are special approval and veto rights that protects the investor's interests. Reserve matter decisions are made only when the investor approves. So, oftentimes, an example of reserve matter, if the company's going to go for sale, acquisition, merger, or liquidation, you need the VC to say, give you the okay before you can proceed. So your board members may decide. Once the board members decide, you need to get the VC's okay before you can proceed. Budget approval. If you're a founder and you went into an investment deal and you said, I'm going to earn, I want to pay myself only $3,000. That's great. Then after a year's time, you say, you know what, I want to pay myself now $25,000. You need the VC to say, yeah, we think you're doing awesome and you should earn $25,000 per month before you can do that. And that's not likely to happen. Okay? Executive removal and appointment. Oftentimes, the businesses have very key players involved. So you have your founders, and then you have your chief executive officers of other sorts. This is really important because if the founders may not be getting along, but guy number 3 that number 1 and number 2 don't like, and guy number 3 is on the fence to get fired, but the VC says, guys, he's who you need to become successful. Even if the founders don't understand that yet, before they can fire him, they need the VC's opinion. They need the VC to say it's okay. Okay? Lastly is a strategic or business plan change. Really important. If first you're selling socks because socks weren't invented and it's a disruptive idea and it's fantastic, keeps people's feet warm, and all of a sudden you go and sell sandals, which are open-toed and keeps feet cold, that's going to significantly change the business. And so the VC needs to say, yes, it's okay, or no, it's not okay. Okay? That's it. Happy to go through anything with you if you have additional questions. Are there questions now? Questions? Questions? Yep.
So I'm just wondering, for all the board members, do they get equal voting rights, or can we assign, let's say, different voting rights?
No. So generally, the only terms I've seen, so every board member will have equal voting rights. The only other term I've seen is if you get a stalemate, then the final decision falls on one person. Okay? So what does that mean? If this is a stalemate decision, like I shared before, then sometimes an investor will say, final decision falls on me. And I make the final call. Or, oftentimes with entrepreneurs, they say final decision falls on the entrepreneur. And they make the final call. And that's okay.
So it has to be pre-agreed before that?
Has to be, this all goes into the legal agreements. Absolutely. Okay? Good?
Thank you.
Okay, good.